The reason so many people never recover from a major setback isn't that they're weak, it's that they fight too soon. Think about what happens in the first days after a major loss. Someone gets laid off on a Thursday, and by Friday, they've sent out 40 applications, not because 40 was the right number, but because stopping felt like surrender. Or a business closes, and before the owner has even understood what went wrong, they're already sketching out the next idea on a napkin. The new idea isn't built on understanding. It's built on the need to not be the person who failed. That urgency feels like strength. It looks like resilience, but in many cases, it's neither. Here's what actually happens. The first impulse after a major setback is often to restore your image before you've assessed your situation. To look recovered before you've started recovering. And that impulse, that need to be seen fighting back, can cost you the very resources you'll need to actually get back on your feet. This video is about 5 specific patterns that can make a major setback harder to recover from. We're calling them the 5 recovery locks. 5 ways that well-intentioned responses to loss can quietly work against the recovery you're trying to build. By the time this is done, you'll understand each of the 5 locks well enough to recognize them. You'll be able to see which one might be most active in your own situation. You'll understand why acting fast doesn't always mean recovering faster. And you'll have one concrete thing you can do in the next 24 hours that doesn't require certainty, money, or a plan that's fully formed. One thing this video won't do: promise you a transformation. Recovery doesn't work on a schedule, and it doesn't look the same for everyone. For some people, recovery means getting back to a version of what they had before. For others, it means adapting to conditions that have permanently changed. Some people recover steadily over months. Some need professional support to get there at all. Some face limitations, economic, physical, personal, that no framework can erase. What this channel offers is strategy, not shortcuts. Strategy that respects both reality and recovery. Before we get into the 5 locks, let's be clear about what recovery actually means here, because the word itself can become part of the problem. In common use, recovery implies return, going back to the point before the loss. But that framing sets a trap. Not every setback allows for a return to the previous state. A job that no longer exists can't be returned to. A relationship that ended for real reasons doesn't just restart. A business model that stopped working won't start working again without fundamental changes. A more useful way to think about recovery: it's the process of restoring your capacity to function sustainably and make meaningful decisions, adapted to whatever the new conditions actually are. That might include rebuilding financial stability, or rebuilding routines that were disrupted, or regaining the ability to concentrate after a period of crisis. It might include choosing a genuinely different direction. Recovery is not about how quickly you look whole again. It's about whether the ground you're standing on is actually solid. That distinction matters, and it's the foundation of everything in this video. In Lionel Giles' translation of Chapter 4 of The Art of War, Sun Tzu writes, "The good fighters of old first put themselves beyond the possibility of defeat, and then waited for an opportunity of defeating the enemy." Sun Tzu was writing about military commanders operating in ancient Chinese warfare. He wasn't writing about layoffs, or divorce, or financial collapse, or reputational crises. Applying his ideas to personal setbacks requires a translation, and that translation is the work of this channel, not a claim about what Sun Tzu intended, but the underlying principle is worth sitting with. Before seeking a visible victory, reduce the possibility of a preventable new loss. That's not passivity. Stabilizing your position is itself an active choice, one that protects your ability to act effectively later. That idea, secure the position before launching the counterattack, runs beneath all 5 locks we're about to discuss, because in almost every case, what makes recovery harder isn't a lack of effort. It's effort pointed in the wrong direction, at the wrong time, for the wrong reasons. Let's start with the first lock. The identity lock is what happens when a setback stops being something that occurred and becomes a conclusion about who you are. This is the moment when the event gets permanently attached to your sense of self. You can often hear it in the language people use. "I lost the job" becomes "I'm a failure." The business closed becomes "I'm not capable." The relationship ended becomes "I'm impossible to love." "I made a public mistake" becomes "My name is ruined." The shift in each case is from an event, something that happened, to a verdict, something that is permanently true. Now, let's not dismiss this too quickly. Major losses can genuinely alter the course of a life. Losing a job at 50 in a contracting industry is not the same as losing a job at 25 with 10 options in front of you. A business closure that wipes out your savings is not a minor setback that reflection alone can solve. Some events do carry real information about what has changed and what's now harder. The distinction the identity lock asks you to make isn't pretend this wasn't serious. It's this: a painful event can offer real information without having the authority to define everything you are. Those are two different things. One is data, the other is a sentence. When the lock closes, when the event becomes the verdict, it doesn't just affect how you feel, it affects the decisions you make. If you're convinced you're not capable, you won't take the steps that require believing you can succeed at them. If you're convinced your name is ruined, you won't reach out to the people who could help you, because contact itself feels like exposure. The identity lock doesn't just create pain, it creates paralysis that looks, from the outside, like a choice not to try. There's a simple 3-part exercise that can help interrupt this pattern. Write down 3 things. The first is the event. State it as factually as possible. What actually happened, without interpretation. Not "I failed." That's already a verdict. Just what occurred. The second is the meaning you're currently attaching to that event. Write it honestly. Don't clean it up. If you're telling yourself you're worthless, or unlovable, or finished, write that. Because you can't examine what you're not willing to name. The third is the next requirement. Not the long-term goal, not the recovery plan. Just, what does your situation actually require of you in the next 72 hours? Here's how that looks in practice. Event: I was laid off, meaning I'm currently assigning I'm no longer valuable. Next requirement: review my expenses, update my resume, and contact 2 people I actually trust. That third column matters enormously, because notice what it does. It focuses attention on action that the situation genuinely requires, not action that the verdict demands. You don't update your resume because you've proven you're valuable. You update it because your situation requires it. The shift in framing is small. The difference in how it feels to do the work is significant. The identity lock doesn't disappear because you've named it. But naming it creates a small gap between the event and the conclusion. And that gap is where decision-making can begin to live again. Now consider the second lock. It goes directly to the warning behind this video. They fight too soon. The urgency lock begins when pressure compresses the distance between pain and commitment. A decision that would normally deserve 3 days of thought gets made in 3 minutes because uncertainty feels unbearable. The danger is not speed by itself. In a genuine emergency, speed can protect you. The danger is decision compression, gathering less information, considering fewer alternatives, and making a difficult-to-reverse move mainly to escape the feeling of standing still. That can look like accepting the first job offer before reading the terms, because unemployment feels humiliating. It can look like signing a long financial commitment to preserve a previous lifestyle. It can look like entering a partnership because the opportunity arrived at the exact moment you needed proof that you were still wanted. It can look like sending the angry email tonight because waiting until morning feels like weakness. Every one of those decisions produces immediate emotional relief. Something has moved. The empty space has been filled. The mind can say, "At least I'm doing something." But emotional relief and strategic progress are not the same result. Some situations genuinely require immediate action. If your housing is at risk, if insurance coverage is about to lapse, if a legal or financial deadline is approaching, or if people who depend on you need accurate information, attention cannot wait. Those are stabilizing actions. They protect the position you still have. A premature counterattack is different. It creates a new obligation before the old damage has been measured. It converts uncertainty into commitment, without first asking whether that commitment serves the life you now have. Use a 3-part decision filter during the early aftermath of a setback. First, what happens if I wait? Name the actual consequence, not the imagined judgment. Does a real option disappear, or do I simply remain uncomfortable for another day? Second, how reversible is this move? Sending one application is reversible. Signing a 12-month lease is not. Asking for information is reversible. Publicly accusing someone is not. The less reversible the decision, the more evidence it deserves. Third, what problem is this action solving? The financial problem, the safety problem, the employment problem, or the emotional problem of not wanting to look defeated. This filter is not an excuse for paralysis. It is a way to match the speed of the decision to the cost of being wrong. When a safe delay is possible, give irreversible choices one full sleep cycle before commitment. Write the decision down. Write what evidence supports it. Then read it again when your nervous system is no longer at its highest point of activation. The person who pauses is not automatically afraid. Sometimes that person is refusing to let pain choose a direction that reality has not yet justified. The urgency lock matters because every rushed commitment draws from the limited resources that must carry the comeback. And after a major loss, what remains often matters more than what has already disappeared. After a major setback, most people focus on what they lost: the job, the income, the relationship, the reputation. And those losses are real. They deserve to be acknowledged directly, not minimized. But there is a second danger that often goes unexamined. The first loss can trigger a cascade. Income drops, so sleep deteriorates. Poor sleep weakens concentration. Weak concentration produces avoidable mistakes. Those mistakes damage confidence and consume more time. One event becomes a chain of preventable secondary losses. The resource lock is what happens when that cascade is allowed to keep moving through the remaining parts of your life. Resources, in this context, aren't only money. They include time, the hours in a day you can actually use for meaningful action. Energy, the cognitive and physical bandwidth that determines how well you can think, decide, and follow through. Attention, your ability to focus on what actually matters versus what's pulling at you emotionally. Credibility, the trust others extend to you, which takes time to rebuild and can be further damaged by rushed decisions. Social support, the relationships that can provide perspective, practical help, and connection. And health, the baseline that everything else depends on, and the first thing abandoned when urgency takes over. Stephen Hobful's work on stress and coping developed conservation of resources theory, which treats threatened or actual resource loss as an important source of stress. The useful insight here is straightforward. An initial loss can leave you with fewer resources available to resist the next one. When something significant is gone, what remains becomes more valuable, because it is what the recovery must begin with. That said, it's important not to overstate this. Not everyone who spends resources managing appearances ends up in a loss spiral. Not every instinct toward action after a setback is driven by shame. Some of what looks like performance is actually necessary. Staying visible in your professional network has real value, for instance, and appearances do matter in some contexts. The question isn't whether any energy goes toward managing your image. The question is whether the proportion has inverted, whether more is going toward appearing stable than toward actually becoming stable. The cascade often begins quietly. A person who has just lost an income stream delays changing the budget because the old spending level feels connected to the old identity. Debt begins to absorb future choices. Another person answers every opportunity because saying no feels dangerous, then divides attention so widely that the strongest opportunity receives mediocre work. A third sacrifices sleep to gain 2 extra hours, then loses twice that amount through slower thinking and preventable errors. The pattern can also move through credibility. Under pressure, a person promises 3 people that everything will be handled by Friday. Friday comes, the promises are missed, and a setback that originally had nothing to do with trust now begins damaging trust. The secondary loss wasn't inevitable. It was created by exceeding the capacity that remained. This is why the question after a setback is not only, what did I lose? It is also, what is the next resource most likely to fall? If money has tightened, perhaps health is exposed. If reputation has been damaged, perhaps attention is being consumed by constant monitoring. If a relationship ended, perhaps work performance is now vulnerable because sleep and concentration have collapsed. Name the next domino before it falls. None of these are signs of failure. They're signs of a lock. And a lock, by definition, can be opened. One concrete step can interrupt the cascade, create what we'll call a resource floor, a set of minimums you will protect for the next 14 days, regardless of how urgent everything feels. Think of it this way. What is the least your situation requires you to maintain in order to keep functioning? That might include a minimum number of hours of sleep you'll protect as non-negotiable. The essential financial obligations you'll prioritize above everything else. The 1 or 2 relationships that are actually sources of support, not obligation, that you'll keep in contact with. A small amount of time, even 30 minutes, reserved for decisions that matter rather than reactions that don't. If you're currently in a health situation that requires attention, that goes on the floor too. This isn't a recovery plan. It's a foundation. You're not trying to solve everything in 2 weeks. You're trying to not lose more ground than you have to, while you figure out the actual path forward. Before you move on from this section, a quick question worth leaving in the comments. After a setback, which resource is hardest for you to protect? Time, energy, money, or trust? Leave one word. No explanation needed. Now let's talk about the 4th lock, because here's what happens in many cases. A person has stabilized somewhat. The immediate crisis has passed. They have a floor, even a fragile one. And then they do something that surprises people who care about them. They disappear. Not physically, necessarily, but they stop responding. They decline the calls. They give brief, reassuring answers when asked how they're doing and change the subject. They make major decisions about jobs, about money, about housing, without talking to anyone. The isolation lock is what happens when shame turns your own stressed perspective into the only source of intelligence you consult. Shame tells you that being seen is dangerous. It says that if people understand the extent of the damage, they will lower their opinion of you. Handling everything alone can then feel like dignity, even while it slowly becomes isolation. The strategic cost is not merely loneliness. It is the loss of error correction. Under stress, attention narrows. The mind returns to the same evidence, the same fear, and the same conclusion. Without an outside point of reference, a doubtful assumption can be repeated until it feels like a confirmed fact. Isolation removes the person who can notice that your plan depends on money you do not have. It removes the colleague who knows that the job market is not as closed as you assume. It removes the friend who can hear that your explanation changes every time you tell it. It removes the professional who can recognize that the problem has crossed beyond what determination alone can safely manage. A distinction worth making clearly. There's a difference between solitude and isolation. Solitude is the deliberate choice to take time alone, to think, to process, to recover your internal equilibrium. Most people need some of that after a major loss, and that's legitimate. Isolation is something different. It's the gradual loss of contact with sources of perspective, support, and honest feedback, driven not by choice, but by shame. The practical difference isn't always obvious from the inside. One question that can help: am I alone right now because it's actually what I need, or because I'm afraid of what people will see? Not everyone has the same support available. Some people are estranged from family. Some are new to a city. Some face abuse, addiction, or professional circumstances that ordinary friends are not equipped to address. This channel does not assume a ready-made network. Research broadly supports the value of reliable social connection. In practice, the first correction may begin with one carefully chosen person or qualified resource. And if the situation involves crisis, if you're not safe, if you're experiencing thoughts of harming yourself, if you're in an environment that's dangerous, the appropriate response isn't figuring it out alone. It's getting actual help from a professional or a crisis resource equipped to provide it. That's not weakness. That's reading the situation accurately. For a serious but non-crisis setback, use a narrow request for error correction. Choose the question before choosing the person. If the question is financial, speak with someone competent in finances. If it concerns an employment contract, use an appropriate professional rather than a motivational friend. If it concerns your interpretation of events, choose someone who can be honest without being cruel. Then present the situation in facts, not a speech designed to win agreement. Say what happened, what you currently believe, and what decision you are considering. Ask, what am I not seeing? Or, which assumption in this plan looks weakest to you? The purpose is not to surrender responsibility. It is to introduce independent information into a system that has become closed. You still choose. You simply stop asking one exhausted mind to serve as witness, analyst, critic, and commander at the same time. Privacy can protect a comeback. Secrecy that eliminates every source of correction can endanger it. Knowing the difference is part of reading your position honestly. The isolation lock begins to open when reality is allowed to enter from more than one direction. We've covered 4 locks now. The identity lock, which turns an event into a verdict. The urgency lock, which launches the counterattack before the position is secured. The resource lock, which spends what's left on appearances rather than capacity. And the isolation lock, which removes the perspective that recovery actually depends on. But there's a 5th, and in some ways it's the deepest one, because it's the one that can survive all 4 of the others. You can know who you are. You can slow down. You can protect your resources. You can stay connected and still rebuild yourself into the same instability that created the crisis in the first place. That's what the 5th lock is about. The terrain lock is the last of the 5, and it's the one most people never examine. The pattern is easy to miss. After a major setback, a person stabilizes enough to start moving again. The worst of the shock has passed. They've protected some resources. They've reconnected with at least one person. They have energy, and then they do something understandable. They head back toward what they knew. The same industry, the same kind of role, the same relationship structure, the same routines that defined them before. Not because they've thought it through and decided it's still right, but because it's familiar, because rebuilding something recognizable feels faster than building something new, because returning to the old shape is the easiest way to prove to themselves and everyone else that the setback didn't permanently alter them. Call this the restoration reflex, the instinct to measure recovery by how closely the future resembles the past. The restoration reflex can be useful when the old structure was sound and the setback was temporary. If a storm damages a solid house, repairing the house makes sense. But if the foundation had been failing for years, restoring every room to its previous appearance only hides the same weakness beneath fresh paint. Lives work the same way. Returning to a familiar role can be wise. Returning automatically is not. Rebuilding a business in the same field can be informed by experience. Rebuilding the same cost structure, the same dependence on one client, and the same refusal to keep reserves is simply repetition wearing the uniform of persistence. This is where courage becomes harder to recognize. Courage may not look like reclaiming the exact title you lost. It may look like accepting a smaller position that teaches you a missing skill. It may not look like restoring the same social circle. It may look like building fewer relationships with clearer boundaries. It may not look like proving that the setback changed nothing. It may look like allowing the event to change something that needed to change. Ask yourself, if nobody from my previous life could see the next move, would I still choose it? That question removes the audience and exposes the structure of the decision. If the answer remains yes, familiarity may be serving you. If the answer changes, the move may be designed less for the future than for the defense of an identity from the past. The goal is not reinvention for its own sake. New terrain is not automatically better terrain. The goal is to stop treating resemblance as proof of recovery and difference as proof of defeat. The problem is that, in some cases, the conditions that made that previous position unsustainable haven't changed. The financial structure that couldn't handle a single income disruption is still there. The work environment that was slowly exhausting them is still that kind of environment. The relationship dynamic that kept repeating a specific pattern, still that pattern. The business model that depended on a market condition that shifted, the market hasn't shifted back. Some people recover their energy only to rebuild the same conditions that made the previous position unstable. This is the terrain lock. It's worth being direct about something here. Not every setback was caused by the person experiencing it. Layoffs happen because companies restructure, and the reasons are often financial or strategic, not personal. Businesses close because of market conditions, economic downturns, problems with timing, competitors, or simple bad luck. Not always because of flawed execution. Relationships end for reasons that involve both people, or that are simply incompatible with long-term stability, and fault is rarely clean. Illness, accidents, discrimination, family responsibilities, economic disadvantage. These are real factors that shape people's situations in ways that don't reduce to personal choices. The terrain lock doesn't ask you to pretend otherwise. It doesn't assign blame for external conditions. What it asks, specifically, is this. Even given what was beyond your control, what can this setback teach you about the terrain you should not rebuild on? That's a different question, and it's the one that tends to go unasked, because it requires looking honestly at the conditions of the previous position, not just the loss of it. A structured way to do that is what this channel calls an after-action review. 4 questions. Not intended to assign fault, intended to transform what happened into usable information. The first question: what was outside my control? Name it specifically. The economic factor, the decision someone else made, the market shift, the health event, the timing. Being honest about what was genuinely beyond your reach isn't deflection, it's accuracy. You can't learn from confusing external conditions with personal failure. The second question: what did I miss or avoid looking at? This is the harder one. Not everything that went wrong was unforeseeable. Some of it, in retrospect, was visible and unaddressed. Maybe the financial margin was always thin, and you knew it. Maybe there were signs in the relationship that you interpreted optimistically. Maybe there was feedback about the work that didn't land the way it should have. Naming what you avoided isn't about self-punishment. It's about making sure you don't avoid the same thing in the next position. The third question: what resource became too fragile? Which thing? Money, time, health, a key relationship, a specific skill, a support system, became depleted to the point where one disruption was enough to cause a collapse. Because that fragility is the thing to address before the next position, not after. The fourth question: what must be different in the next position? Not what do you want to be different. What must be. The non-negotiable structural changes that the previous experience has made clear. If the answer is nothing, that's worth examining carefully. The after-action review isn't a one-time conversation with yourself. It's something you return to over time, as the clarity that comes with distance allows you to see things that the immediate aftermath couldn't. In the early weeks after a major setback, the answers may be incomplete. That's fine. Start anyway. Now let's talk about what to actually do with all of this, because a framework without a direction is just a set of categories. We're calling this the recovery position. Not a 30-day cure. Not a transformation schedule. A 30-day window in which you build a more stable foundation than the one you're currently standing on. That's all. 5 components. First, 1 capacity to restore. Not all of them. 1. What single ability, when functioning, most improves your capacity to make good decisions? For some people, it's the ability to concentrate, severely disrupted after extended stress. For others, it's physical energy, neglected because everything else felt more urgent. For others, it's the ability to follow through on commitments without falling behind. Identify the one that, if restored, would improve everything else. Then put specific actions behind it. Second, 1 resource floor to protect. Return to what you identified earlier, the minimums that allow you to keep functioning. Write them down. Commit to them explicitly. The floor is not a ceiling. You can exceed it, but it's the line you don't cross downward, no matter what urgency demands. Third, 1 source of support. 1 person, 1 professional resource, 1 community. Something outside your own head that provides honest feedback, perspective, or practical help. If you already have someone, make the commitment explicit. If you don't, the next step is identifying who that could realistically be. Fourth, 1 assumption to test. After a major setback, there are almost always conclusions formed under pressure that haven't been examined carefully. Maybe an assumption about what the job market will accept from you, an assumption about how long recovery is going to take, an assumption about what people think of you now. Pick one. Identify what evidence would actually confirm or disconfirm it. Then find that evidence, not from your own projections, but from the actual world. Fifth, 1 difficult-to-reverse decision to postpone until the evidence improves. Identify the major move: a contract, a large financial commitment, a relocation, a partnership, a relationship decision, and name explicitly what you would need to know before making it responsibly. Then wait until you know it. 30 days won't complete your recovery. It wasn't meant to. What it can do is move you from an unstable position to a more defensible one. And from a more defensible position, the next step becomes clearer. Let's bring the 5 locks back together, briefly. The identity lock turns the event into a verdict. It convinces you that what happened is a final statement about who you are, not information about what changed. The exercise is separating the event from the meaning from the next requirement. The urgency lock compresses the distance between pain and commitment. The filter is simple. What happens if I wait? How reversible is the move? and what problem does it truly solve? The resource lock allows one loss to knock down the next. The protection is a floor, and the discipline to identify the next domino before it falls. The isolation lock makes one stressed perspective your only intelligence source. The answer is targeted error correction from a trustworthy and relevant outside voice. And the terrain lock rebuilds the same conditions that produce the instability. The after-action review is the way through. 4 questions that turn pain into information without requiring you to pretend the pain isn't real. None of these locks mean you're weak. That's not what this video has been saying. In fact, every one of them, the urgency, the isolation, the rush back to familiar terrain, is a response that makes complete sense given the pressure that follows a major loss. The problem isn't the impulse, it's what the impulse costs when it runs without any examination. In the next 24 hours, do 3 things. Identify which of the 5 locks feels most active right now. The one that, if you're being honest, has the most grip on how you're thinking and deciding. You don't have to solve it today. Just name it. Write the next requirement. Not the goal. Not the plan. The thing that your situation actually needs from you in the next 72 hours. One specific, doable thing. Protect one resource before making one difficult-to-reverse move. Identify the next domino and keep it standing. If you're rebuilding right now and you want practical strategy for making the next move without turning one defeat into a chain of new losses, subscribe to the Comeback General. This channel is about reading changed conditions clearly, resisting the restoration reflex, and building a comeback that can survive contact with real life. There's a lot of content about coming back stronger. There's less about coming back honestly. That's the gap this channel exists to fill. The setback changed the situation, and the old map may no longer describe the ground beneath you. Familiar routes may not lead where they once did, and some may no longer exist. Recovery does not begin by pretending the map is unchanged. It begins by reading the new conditions clearly, choosing ground that can hold you, and moving deliberately without rushing a position you have not yet secured. That's where the next move starts.